They say the human face changes every few generations. That time smooths the edges of resemblance, letting strangers forget they were once kin. But in one forgotten valley, time never moved forward. Faces repeated themselves. Eyes mirrored those of the dead. And every child born carried the ghost of another who had lived before them. The place had no outsiders, no weddings from beyond its hills, no fresh voices in the church pews. It was a world sealed shut, a bloodline without strangers. In the heart of rural America, there once stood a cluster of houses, more shadows than homes. Wood rotted into soil, but the names never changed. The same surnames carved into every mailbox, every headstone, every school record that yellowed with age. They say when you walked through that place, you could feel it, the weight of familiarity so thick it pressed on your lungs. Everyone knew everyone, and yet no one seemed alive in the way you'd expect. Locals who passed through whispered strange things, that their voices sounded the same, slow, breathy, drawn out, as if they were rehearsing lines written generations before. That when one spoke, another would finish the sentence, not out of habit, but as if thought itself was shared. It began in the 1800s, a single family, isolated by geography and pride. They owned the valley, the fields, and the few dirt roads leading in or out. When the last bridge washed away, no one rebuilt it. They didn't need to. They said it was God's way of keeping them pure. The first generation made the choice. The next one forgot they had one. And by the fourth, the valley had rewritten itself into something unrecognizable, not by sin, but by silence. What survives now are fragments, old records, census notes, photos with faces too similar to belong to different people. The evidence is thin, but what it suggests is almost too dark to believe, because this is not a story about evil, it's about what happens when love has nowhere left to go, when family becomes the only world you know, and the line between kinship and confinement disappears. It began with the McAllens, a name you won't find on modern maps, but once it was known in the county, not for wealth, not for prominence, but for the land they refused to leave. 300 acres of low valley and high mist ringed by forests so thick even the wind sounded muffled. They came from the east, farmers, hard-working, God-fearing, and terrified of outsiders. The first generation was ordinary. They built a church, small and square, and a family cemetery right beside it. That was how the story was supposed to go. A few graves, a few births, a quiet legacy. But when the railroad cut north instead of through their land, the valley began to vanish from the map. Trade stopped. Roads crumbled. The children grew up seeing only the same faces, hearing only the same last names. At first, it wasn't a choice. It was circumstance. By the time of the second generation, it became doctrine. Old family journals, the few that survived, spoke in strange holy language, words like purity, blood covenant, the circle unbroken. They weren't talking about faith anymore, they were talking about lineage. A local preacher once tried to intervene. He said the McAllens had turned scripture into something else, something self-made and dangerous. He vanished that same winter. Some say he left town in frustration. Others think the valley kept him. The isolation deepened. When the outside world fell into the Great Depression, no one from the valley registered for aid. When the Second World War began, no one enlisted. When the census came through in 1950, it marked something almost impossible. Nearly 50 people, all bearing only 2 surnames. Neighbors from the next town over started to whisper, not out of cruelty, but out of disbelief. They said the McAllen blood ran in circles, that their children bore faces too familiar and eyes that never seemed to match their age, and that when you looked long enough, you couldn't tell who was whose child anymore. The valley wasn't dead. It was preserved, like a specimen trapped in amber, frozen in its own devotion, cut off from time, from change, from the concept of stranger, and as the decades passed, The faces didn't evolve. They echoed, each one a reflection of the last, a mirror of the buried. By the 1960s, the valley had become something closer to a relic than a town. Outsiders rarely entered, not because of danger, but because of the air of stillness that greeted anyone who tried. It was as though the land itself had fallen asleep. Travelers spoke of silence so deep it bordered on unnatural. Even birds avoided the power lines. The postman, one of the few who still made the monthly trip, described the same oddity every time. Faces that looked copied, movements that seemed rehearsed. They didn't stare at strangers with suspicion, they simply watched, like people looking into a mirror that no longer surprised them. Those who dared to photograph the valley in that era, journalists, anthropologists, even a curious doctor or two, brought back images that haunted the public imagination. Children with identical eyes, men whose jawlines matched so perfectly it looked like a trick of light, and women whose smiles were eerily uniform, thin, polite, but distant, as if shaped by memory rather than emotion. It was easy to sensationalize them. Some called them cursed, others called them the ghostkin, but beneath the surface of mockery was something quieter, something more human. Because beneath the strange genetics and mirrored features was a story about fear, the kind passed down like an heirloom. They feared outsiders because outsiders took. Their ancestors had built something, however small, however flawed, and the world had abandoned them for it. So they turned inward. They trusted only their own. But when a community closes in on itself for long enough, it forgets how to breathe. Love becomes obligation, marriage becomes repetition, birth becomes echo. And so the McAllens and the families bound to them lived in that rhythm, generation after generation, repeating not only blood, but thought. Old beliefs hardened into law. No stranger could betray. Was dead. No stranger could be loved. There's a story of a young woman, one of the last to ever leave the valley. She was 19, and they say she ran off during a thunderstorm, barefoot and crying. When someone asked her years later why she left, she said, "Because I couldn't tell if my children would look like me or my mother." In that single sentence, she revealed what the valley had become. Not evil, not monstrous, just lost. A family turned inward for so long it forgot that blood is meant to flow, not circle. By the 1970s, the valley had started to rot from the inside out. Not visibly, not at first. The home still stood, the same families still gathered each Sunday, the same rituals carried on. But something inside them had gone quiet. You could see it in their eyes. Not madness, not violence, but vacancy. As if too many generations had lived in the same faces, and the soul simply ran thin. A social worker once described visiting a family deep in that valley. She said the home was spotless, unnaturally clean, with the smell of bleach thick in the air. The children sat still at the kitchen table, hands folded, eyes down. When she asked their names, the eldest girl said softly, "We don't use names here. We already know who we are." That phrase stayed with her for years. We already know who we are. It was meant to sound obedient, but it carried something else. Resignation. As if identity itself had become irrelevant. There are reports, faint, scattered, mostly ignored, of genetic abnormalities emerging by that time. Speech delays, minor deformities, an unsettling sameness of mannerisms. Doctors who examined the few who left the valley described them as genetically echoic, a poetic phrase for something deeply biological. But the physical changes weren't the most haunting part. It was what they did to time. When a place loses outsiders, it loses reference points. No new words, no new customs, no new stories. Children grew up repeating their grandparents' slang, their old songs, even their fears. The past wasn't behind them anymore. It was all around them, looping endlessly. There are photographs from that period, small, faded, most taken by state workers. In them, it's hard to tell the ages of the people. A man of 40 looks like his own nephew. A grandmother's features are nearly identical to her daughter's. Generations became indistinguishable, and when the outside world finally tried to intervene, it was too late. Half of them refused help, the rest didn't understand why anyone would offer it. To them, isolation wasn't a prison. It was protection. The valley had become its own world, one where every voice, every face, every heartbeat belonged to the same long echo. And yet, beneath the decay, there was still something profoundly human. They loved each other, fiercely, desperately, even as that love became the very thing that consumed them. By the 1980s, the valley was barely spoken of outside local rumor. Maps began dropping its name altogether. You could drive past it on the state highway and never know what lay beyond the tree line, a fading world where bloodlines had folded in on themselves like old photographs curling in the heat. Those who did go in, state officials, anthropologists, one or two journalists, rarely stayed long. They described the same eerie pattern. Every road seemed to lead back to where it started. Every path looked identical. Even the people moved with the same rhythm, as if bound to some invisible choreography. When one reporter asked a man about the outside world, television, the new millennium, anything, the man only smiled and said, "We have everything we need here. Why would we trade faces with strangers?" That line would become infamous in local folklore. Trade faces with strangers. To outsiders, it sounded poetic, eerie, even grotesque. But to the McAllens and those still bound by their blood, it meant something else, that outsiders change you, and change was something they could no longer endure. Eventually, nature began to reclaim what was left. The fields overgrew, the houses sagged, and the church bells stopped ringing for good. Only a handful remained, the oldest ones, the ones who couldn't imagine life beyond the boundaries of the same last name. There's a haunting set of photographs from 1987, the last time anyone officially documented the valley. Every person in them is looking directly at the camera, not smiling, not afraid, just watching. And if you look closely, you notice something unnerving. The same gaze in every pair of eyes, the same faint tilt of the head, as though the entire valley were a single consciousness, divided into many faces, and then, suddenly, nothing. No records, no census, no burial logs. The valley simply stopped existing on paper. Locals from neighboring counties say the land was bought up quietly in the 1990s. Private property now, fenced, locked, forgotten. But sometimes hikers who wander too close claim they can still hear faint sounds carried through the trees. Children laughing, a woman humming a tune that hasn't been sung in half a century, and footsteps that sound familiar. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have stayed to protect it, or walked away to save yourself? Because in the end, the McAllens didn't vanish. They just became part of the soil, a memory that breathes only when someone remembers it. For decades, the McAllen Valley was nothing more than a rumor, a whisper traded in roadside diners and rural newspapers that no longer print. But then, in 2003, something surfaced. A group of land surveyors stumbled upon the remnants of an old homestead deep in those woods. Collapsed roofs, rusted stoves, jars still sealed with the names E. McAllen and Ruth Ann. But what they found in the basement was what made the story impossible to ignore. Inside a chest, wrapped in oilcloth and newspaper, were photographs, hundreds of them. Some taken professionally, some clearly by hand. The same faces repeated across decades. A child in 1920, a teenager in 1950, an old woman in 1980, all bearing the same eyes, the same jawline, the same faint scar above the lip. Different ages, different lifetimes, but always the same blood. Researchers who analyzed the collection later called it the Archive of Reflection. No official records linked to it exist, but fragments have leaked through online forums, private collections, and university archives, each photo a haunting echo of the one before. Alongside the photos were notebooks, written in faded ink, that told pieces of the family's inner logic. Lines that read like sermons, but carried no scripture. One entry, dated 1946, said, "The world outside mixes and forgets. We remember by remaining." Another, "Each birth is a mirror of the last. To be pure is to repeat." The handwriting grew shakier over time, but the meaning stayed consistent. A closed circle of belief, both beautiful and horrific in its devotion. Geneticists who later reviewed the lineage through DNA recovered from old remains found something extraordinary. An almost complete genetic bottleneck. An entire population built upon itself for so long that mutation became inevitability. They weren't monsters. They were the result of faith taken too far. Faith not in God, but in blood. And perhaps that's what makes their story so deeply disturbing. Because the McAllens weren't cursed. They were human beings who wanted to belong to something eternal. And when they couldn't find eternity beyond their hills, they tried to build it in their own veins. What remains now are only questions, fragments of a history that feels more like myth. Who buried those photos? Who wanted them found? And what kind of love drives people to erase the very idea of strangers from existence? The valley no longer exists on any official record, but every once in a while someone surfaces, a person whose ancestry leads back to nowhere. A woman in Tennessee who can't find a single relative born outside one county line. A man in West Virginia whose DNA test returns results labeled only as inconclusive, possible endogamy. They don't know it, but their lineage hums with the faint pulse of the McAllen blood, the last whispers of a name the earth itself has tried to forget. There's a story, one the locals only tell when the night is deep and the power flickers, about a child born just before the valley disappeared, the last to carry the name. She was taken from the valley by a state worker and placed with another family hundreds of miles away. For years, she grew up believing she was adopted from nowhere special. But as she aged, the mirror became her only enemy. She once told an interviewer, "Every few years my face changes, not aging, just shifting. Sometimes I see someone I've never met." She had found one of the old photographs, a child from the 1930s with her exact expression, her same uneven eyes. That was when she stopped talking about her past entirely. And maybe that's the final curse of the McAllens, that even when time finally moved on, their reflection lingered. Not in the valley, but in the blood of those who never knew its name. When you look at old photographs, at your ancestors' faces, you can trace the curve of your own, a comforting thought for most. But for them, it was a sentence, to see themselves over and over until the end of the line. Some say the land is still out there, fenced and hidden beneath federal soil, overgrown with moss and silence. If you stand there long enough, the forest hums with something that isn't quite wind. Some swear they've heard it, a soft, overlapping murmur, like voices trying to remember a name, at that time has erased. And maybe in that echo, the McAllens still live, not as people, but as memory. A reminder of what happens when isolation replaces love, when fear becomes tradition, and when family stops being a bond and turns into a cage. Because in the end, their greatest tragedy wasn't how they lived, it's that they truly believed they were protecting themselves. And maybe that's the part none of us can look away from. Because every family in its own way hides a door that was meant to stay closed. The McAllens just forgot to stop knocking.